Happy Pride Month, everyone. Just like last year, we are coming in right at the end of the month to keep the party going just as everyone else prepares for whatever comes after Pride Month. Wrath Month, I presume. And indeed, like last year, I wanted to take a moment to explore the topic of gender identity politics in Japan through the lens of video games. In 2023's video, we discussed in detail how Japan and indeed much of East Asia or even Southeast and Central Asia have a very different approach to LGBT matters than we often do in the West. Now in the West, we tend to see the LG as being more mainstream, but the T as more transgressive, whereas in East Asia, the exact opposite tends to be the case. Now let's be very clear, this does not mean that being trans in East Asia is by any means easy or even safe. Being trans is merely more acceptable in East Asia to some extent, due to how East Asian cultures prioritize social harmony over individual liberty. How transitioning one's gender can be seen as conforming to societal norms as opposed to disrupting said norms by being gay. If you're interested in learning more about that, why not take a look at last year's Pride Month video? I'll forewarn that it isn't my most detailed work and that it has some weaknesses and errors. At one point, I used the word transgenderism, not knowing the connotations that word has for the trans community. As someone who is merely an ally and thus not LGBT myself, and as someone who has very little exposure to the wider internet, we'll say, I must sincerely apologize for that error and beg your forgiveness for any further errors I may yet commit. Still, if the topic of how Japan handles trans characters differently sounds interesting to you, that video might be worth your time. In this video, though, I'd like to explore specifically the monumental changes that occurred in the past year, particularly with regards to trans rights in Japan. It's not an exaggeration to say that more progress has been made for trans rights in Japan between June 2023 and now than perhaps the entire previous decade, though we must note, of course, that this is the nature of progress. People work hard behind the scenes pushing on a cause until the cause yields on the levee breaks. I'm not trying to discredit the hard work of the Japanese LGBT community in the past decade, I'm just trying to bring to all of your attention the victories that they've achieved in the past year. And we're going to do so through the lens of a video game character whom we've already talked a little bit about, that character being Vivian in Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. This video is a celebration, a victory lap, if you will, for LGBT rights in East Asia. And this video is brought to you by nobody. It was a big struggle to find a sponsor for last year's Pride Month video, and this one got rejected by like 7 different sponsors. But that's alright. As a wise man once said, the revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. Indeed, the revolution will not be televised. So consider this video brought to you by this video's fundraiser, which we'll talk more about towards the end of the video. In any case, let's get right to it and start our discussion by going back in time to the year 2002. Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, originally released on July 22, 2002 on the GameCube, is, in my opinion, one of the best role-playing games ever made. And I've played an absolute ton of RPGs. There's something magical about the whole experience. You get the vibes of a game like Mother 3 or even Undertale, but with great, compelling gameplay, all packaged in the rich but largely unexplored universe of Mario. In so doing, Thousand-Year Door accomplishes what no other Mario RPG, not even the other Paper Mario games, has. It makes the world of Mario feel alive, feel lived in. It feels almost like a good book in that way. You can get lost in the world, in the humor, and in the characters. It is this feeling, this vibe, by my reckoning, that separates good role-playing games from the great and the great from the legendary. Which is to say, the aspect that I feel takes a great RPG and makes it unforgettable is meaningfulness. And Thousand-Year Door is an experience overflowing with meaningfulness where you least expect it. Recently, Thousand-Year Door had a remake. The remake was announced during the September 14, 2023 Nintendo Direct, and the game itself was released on May 23, 2024. As such, when I brought up Thousand-Year Door in last year's Pride Month video, I had no idea that we'd have the opportunity to explore this game and its themes again so soon within the context of trans rights in Japan. But here we are, and as we will see, not unlike Japan itself, this remake of Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door takes some monumental steps. steps towards the normalization of trans people in Japan that may not seem like much to a casual observer, but is truly a meaningful gesture that should not be understated. If you remember last year's video, you may recall that there is a character in Thousand Year Door named Vivian. She's a ghost, one of 3 sisters, and depending on the version of the original Thousand Year Door you played, depending on the localization, Vivian has an extremely different story. In every localization, Vivian is presented as an individual who suffers from an identity crisis, which appears to stem in part from her 2 bullying sisters, Marilyn and Beldam. But from there, the type of identity crisis Vivian has and the treatment she receives from her sisters in turn differs quite substantially. In the original Japanese version of Thousand Year Door, quoting now from this page on Thousand Year Door regional differences from tcrf.net, Vivian identifies and presents as female but is described as actually being an effeminate-looking boy. Vivian's description in-game states that he may look like a girl but he's actually a boy. And indeed, this male-female confusion is played as sort of a running joke. Goombella, a character with an identify ability, identifies Vivian as the youngest sister of the Shadow Trio before correcting sister to brother. When we are introduced to Vivian and her sisters, she introduces the 3 of them as the Shadow Sisters, only to be admonished by her sister Beldam, who states, "Where are these 3 sisters? Aren't you a man?" To which a sheepish Vivian thereafter apologizes. Now, the original Japanese characterization of Vivian and her gender identity carries across to most, but importantly not all, of the other localizations. Vivian's lines in the French and Spanish localizations of Thousand Year Door are similar, for example, to the original Japanese. The English and German localizations, however, completely omit the gender identity plotline from Vivian's character. Indeed, if you were like me and you played the old game in English, you might never even have known that Vivian was a trans character. Whereas in the original Japanese, Vivian is portrayed as being a boy that looks like a girl, Vivian's identity crisis in the English and German versions of the game is replaced with an inferiority complex. Despite being a beautiful woman, her sisters denigrate her appearance and put her down. Instead of "Where are these 3 sisters? Aren't you a man?" we get "I don't see 3 beauties, I see 2, and then there's you and you are plug ugly." There is, however, one final localization that both departs from the original Japanese while also electing not to omit the gender identity storyline as the English and German localizations did. The localization I speak of is, surprisingly, the Italian version of Thousand Year Door. In Italiano, instead of "he may look like a girl but he's actually a boy" or "she has an inferiority complex," we get "she used to be a man, but now she's a woman, and proud of it." This article, also found on TCRF, implies that the Italian localization differs because the submissive portrayal of Vivian in the Japanese version would not have conveyed the sense of hurt and insult that Vivian feels to an Italian audience, but that the indignance associated with being insulted for something that you are already proud of does indeed resonate better with Italians. Which I will state for the record is pretty frickin' Italian, alright? Not that I would know. Now, in last year's Pride Month video, we celebrated this funny little translation quirk and gave Italy a well-deserved W. But last year's Pride Month video was released, you will recall, prior to the announcement of the Thousand Year Door remake. How then was Vivian's gender identity treated in the remake? And what changed between 2004 and 2024, or for that matter between 2023 and 2024 that may have influenced the remake? You didn't think you were going to get away from me without a little education, did you? Well, let's go backwards in time just briefly, and use this 1,000-year opportunity to talk about recent LGBT rights developments in Japan. The development and release of Thousand Year Door in 2004, and the portrayal of Vivian as a struggling and denigrated trans woman in that game, coincides with a controversial law that was passed in Japan just a year prior in 2003. This law was called the Act on Special Cases in Handling Gender Status for Persons with Gender Identity Disorder, or colloquially Law 111. This law went into effect in July of 2004, literally the same month that Thousand Year Door was released in Japan. The law was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allowed trans people in Japan to legally change their gender for the first time. On the other hand, Law 111 required trans people to undergo sexual reassignment surgery and sterilization to legally transition, and said trans people couldn't have children under the age of 20. 20 being the age of majority at the time. That's right, until 2022, the age of majority in Japan was 20. Extremely unfun fact, the age of consent in Japan was 13 years old until June of 2023, meaning that prior to 2002, Japan simultaneously had one of the world's highest ages of majority and lowest ages of consent. Now, to be fair, most, if not all, of the prefectures had raised the age of consent to 16 already. Nevertheless, the nationwide age of majority was lowered to 18 in 2022, and the age of consent raised to 16 in 2023. A change that was a relief to everyone except an unpleasant subfaction of weebs/otaku and, presumably, Dr. Disrespect. But I digress. Back to Law 111, the sterilization requirement for legally transitioning was challenged but upheld by the Supreme Court of Japan in January of 2019. The court's reasoning for upholding the requirement was to prevent confusion in parent-child relations and abrupt changes in Japanese society, social harmony over individual liberty. But two judges in the majority also called upon the National Diet to review these invasive requirements and asked for society to embrace the diversity of sexual identity. Yet despite the pleas of these two judges, there would not be that much movement in Japanese jurisprudence with regards to trans rights. In fact, one might even say that the development of trans rights in Japan between 2004 to 2023 was rather stagnant. There were some societal developments, of course. In 2020, for example, Ochanomizu University and Nara Women's University became the first Japanese universities to accept trans students. Also in 2020, Japan Women's University, the oldest private women's university in Japan, announced that it would also start accepting trans students, albeit starting only in 2024. But then in 2022, a trans person was arrested for using the wrong bathroom in Osaka. So, as it is with social change anywhere, there was a bit of give and a bit of take, and it seemed, at least with trans rights and trans acceptance in Japan, that every step forward was met with an equal step backwards, at least on paper. As we alluded to earlier in the video though, progress in hearts moves gradually, and sometimes invisibly, while progress on paper moves quite suddenly. In 2020, just a year after the Supreme Court of Japan upheld the sterilization requirement of Law 111, a trans woman had her gender change rejected by lower courts on account of that same requirement. This matter was escalated to the Supreme Court, which then made a landmark decision on October of 2023, striking down the sterilization requirement as unconstitutional. Though notably, the court did not strike down the gender-affirming surgery/treatment requirement. That said, gender-affirming surgery/treatment can also be mere hormone replacement therapy. In February of 2024, a court in Okoyama approved a trans man's request for gender change, finding that his hormone replacement therapy made him eligible for a legal change of gender pursuant to Law 111. We are seeing a rather monumental shift in Japan right now with regards to not only trans rights, but LGBT rights as a whole. To be clear, the Japanese conservative government, the LDP, has historically been quite resistant to the idea of LGBT rights. Japan is the only country in the G7 that doesn't recognize gay marriage, despite surveys showing very high support for gay marriage amongst the general Japanese populace. In March of 2023, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida stated that he did not think that banning same-sex couples from marrying is unjust discrimination. Prime Minister Kishida's former aide, one Masayoshi Arai, was willing to say the quiet part out loud for him, quoting now directly from NHK. "I don't want to see same-sex couples. I don't like them if they live next door. If Japan recognizes same-sex marriage, some people will abandon the country." On the topic of Prime Minister Kishida and the LDP's stance on gay marriage, Arai stated, "All the secretaries to the Prime Minister are against it." Despite the Prime Minister's stance, however, in March of 2024, the Sapporo High Court and the Tokyo District Court found that the Japanese government's ban on same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. And as for Kishida and his cabinet, a recent NHK poll shows their approval rating at an all-time low of 21%. So who knows? Perhaps more positive change is on the way. Perhaps before long, we'll see gay marriage finally legalized in Japan. In 2024, we've seen both Thailand and Nepal legalize gay marriage, finally joining my beloved Taiwan, which legalized gay marriage back in 2019. Could Japan be next? Could Japan actually legalize gay marriage? For the first time ever, I can tell you that the answer is maybe. And you know, I never thought I'd be able to say that. It sure does feel good. Back in 2022, the Osaka District Court rejected the arguments of same-sex couples, arguing that Japan's ban on same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. It was a dark time for LGBT rights in Japan. But do you know who vocally and vehemently disagreed with the Osaka District Court at the time? Believe it or not, the answer is Nintendo. On July 12, 2022, Nintendo Japan updated its corporate social responsibility guidelines to include a partnership system for employees in response to the district court's decision. Quoting now from a memo produced by Nintendo concerning this partnership system, although same-sex marriages are not currently recognized under Japanese law, this system ensures employees who are in a domestic partnership with a same-sex partner have the same benefits as employees in an opposite-sex marriage. We have also established that a common law marriage between couples will be observed in the same way as a legal marriage. Nintendo was ahead of the game. Which is why when I see now how the Thousand Year Door remake treats Vivian and the timing of said remake, I can't help but to wonder whether the timing of the release is a coincidence or if, indeed, there is something more intentional at play. Just as the original Thousand Year Door released amidst the controversy of Law 111, reflecting therein a bit of that controversy, the remake releases just as the worst aspects of Law 111 are finally found unconstitutional, and reflects therein a bit of that catharsis. The Thousand Year Door remake is, in most respects, a fairly faithful recreation of the original game. It preserves the script and tone and plot and design of the game. It's almost more like a remaster than a remake. Yet when it comes to the character of Vivian and her story, we see not the original Japanese characterization, but a characterization more akin to the one used in the Italian localization. Both the English and the Japanese versions of the Thousand Year Door remake now include more inclusive language and directly reference Vivian's identity as a trans woman, painting the misgenderings she receives from her bullying sisters in a starkly negative light and providing a sympathetic look into the struggles of trans people everywhere. I'll end the video with this little anecdote. In 2023, Japanese book publisher Kadokawa announced that it would bring a translation of Abigail Schreier's pseudo-scientific work, Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, to Japan. Kadokawa's stated reason for bringing the book over was to help readers in Japan deepen their discussions about gender through what is happening in Europe and the United States. The announcement was met with public outcry, not from Westerners who had no idea that this was even happening, but by the Japanese people themselves. There were even members of the Japanese publishing industry who wrote to express how such a hateful book could, and I quote, threaten the safety and human rights of the people involved. Within mere days, the plan to publish Schreier's work was rescinded, and Kadokawa apologized. There's real and meaningful change happening in Japan with regards to trans rights and trans acceptance, and indeed with regards to LGBT rights as a whole. And if even Japan can see such social progress in defiance of its government, why, I'd say it's possible just about anywhere. In last year's Pride video, I stated that the Rainbow Road is long and perilous, but that it does have a finish line. Well, turns out in Japan at least, we might have just entered the final lap. I've been your host, Mooney. I hope you enjoyed this year's short, unsponsored Pride Month special. Transition, a special thanks to all of Moon Channel's esteemed patrons and to all the donors to our ongoing fundraiser for victims of the flooding in Rio Grande do Sul. The following donors reached out to me directly, and I'd like to thank them all personally. If you sent a donation to my email and I didn't get to it, please let me know in the comments and send me a new email. In any case, a special thanks to Nathaniel S., Matthew C., Sunny H., Xander L., and Aurora. To my friend Faye and to artist Yu Fong for the thumbnail. And last but not least, thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.